Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and welcome to our next unit in History 3380, History of Business and Technology. And you're going to have to excuse me during this lecture because I have to look at my notes. I don't have this one really memorized, but I'm going to get through it the best I can. So the big deal for this week is this idea of monopolies and government regulation of business. And so the reason I bring it up now is because after the Civil War, so the Civil War ends in 1865, businesses start to really boom in the U.S. The economy starts to take off. And the two businesses we're going to talk about in this module are steel, which is Carnegie, and we're going to talk about petroleum, which is John D. Rockefeller. Now, understand that a lot of other things are going on in the country. The railroads are going crazy as far as expansion goes. The Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869, so now the East Coast and the West Coast is connected by rail. So there's a lot of growth in the country in between the East and the West Coast because transportation routes are open. And that's an important thing to think about when we're thinking about the history of business and the history of the economy in the U.S. Without transportation, business isn't going to thrive and the country isn't going to expand. So before the railroads, as you know, all there were canals and basically horse and buggy. And now with the railroad expanding across the country, the economy starts to boom, society starts to expand, cities start to grow. Cities in the Midwest, especially a city like Chicago, starts to grow because of the transportation routes that are now available. So that's sort of the background. And one of the things I always say about this period of time between 1865 and 1900 is it's really the build out of our country. Because if you look at the big cities of today, Chicago, Cleveland, any of the cities in the near west, so like Omaha, Nebraska, those Kansas City, those cities, they really start to expand with transportation routes. And even if you look at older cities, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, New York, those cities are a lot older, but they really start to expand after the Civil War. Skyscrapers are being built for the first time. Bridges are being built for the first time. And one of the reasons for that is the advent of steel. So that's a good place to kind of transition to this week's reading. You have one chapter of a book to read this week, Empire of Wealth, and I want you to pay careful attention to this chapter because it sort of sums up everything you need to know for this module. So the chapter begins with the Bessemer process. So that's a process for making steel, and it's really important because before the 1850s, there wasn't really any steel made in large quantities. There was steel made in Spain, there was steel made in England, but it was all in small quantities and it was very expensive. Now, you have to understand a little bit about steel. Steel is made of iron, and there is cast iron or pig iron, and there's wrought iron, and those materials are very strong from a standpoint of compression, but they don't have any tensile strength, so they're really heavy and they're not good for building long spans such as bridges. So steel is what you need for that, and steel was really difficult to manufacture prior to the 1850s. So I'm looking at my year here, so bear with me because I forget the dates. So in 1856, this guy named Henry Bessemer in England, by mistake, invents the Bessemer process, which is a way to take iron, get the impurities out, blow oxygen into it, add carbon, and create steel. So Bessemer creates this process in the 1850s. And a gentleman from the U.S., Andrew Carnegie, who was involved in businesses up until the time he was 20 years old. It was really the American dream. Carnegie comes along, sees what Bessemer's doing, and buys Bessemer furnaces and buys the patent rights for the Bessemer process in the U.S., and starts Carnegie Steel, which it was a great time to start Carnegie Steel because of all the expansion going on. Steel was needed for railroad rails, for bridges, for skyscrapers, all of that stuff. So it was a great business to be in, and Carnegie got very wealthy doing it. Around the same time, 1857, I believe, Colonel Drake discovered oil in western Pennsylvania, and that was the first oil well in the U.S. So oil was really, it was known before the 1850s, but it really began to be utilized by being refined and making kerosene in the 1850s, 1860s. And what we see there is John D. Rockefeller and the rise of Standard Oil. So those two people, Carnegie and Rockefeller, are really the focus of the chapter you're going to read. And I frame this around this notion of a historical era called the Gilded Age, because the Gilded Age is what historians call this period of time between 1865 and 1900. This idea that a lot of people got very rich and lived in gilded homes, you know, and everything was sort of gold covered, if you will, for a lot of people. Now, this is also the time there's a great disparity between rich and poor, because you have people like Morgan, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, the Vanderbilts, and others who have a lot of money. In the meantime, workers are really being exploited because there's no unions in place yet. And so we start to see this disparity between the haves and the have-nots. So keep that in mind. And the reason I selected this chapter for you to read is because it gives you a snippet of all of those things. And it talks about Rockefeller, it talks about Carnegie, and it talks about exploitation of workers. So the other thing it talks about that you should know, I don't think we're going to have it on a quiz, but it talks about Carnegie and vertical integration. So when we're talking about monopolies, that is one business controlling the market, there's two different ways to look at that. Carnegie was really into vertical integration, which means not only did he own the steel mills and own the processes, but he also owned iron ore mines, and he also owned transportation routes between the mines and the steel mills. So this idea of vertical integration is he owned everything that had anything to do with the steel making process. On the other hand, when we look at John D. Rockefeller, he's more of a horizontal integration business person in that he owned all the refineries. So he might not have owned any oil wells, but he owned all the refineries. So his monopoly was really horizontal. Either way, both Carnegie and Rockefeller dominated the market for steel and for petroleum, respectively. So this is the first time we see monopolies crop up in the country. And I think most of you know what a monopoly is. It's explained in the reading a little bit, but for us, for the purposes of this class, it's simply one business controlling a given marketplace. So Carnegie controlled steel and Rockefeller controlled petroleum distillation or refining. Today, you might want to say that Windows, that Microsoft dominates the desktop operating space. So that's kind of a monopoly, maybe, but you know, there's Macintosh and there's Linux. So that's something to think about, and that's going to be part of the discussion this week. I want you to think about who's a monopoly, who's close to being a monopoly. Now, often we think monopolies are bad because they can set prices in the market, and they certainly can, but the author that you're reading this week is sort of a consensus pro-business historian, so he dispels that myth, and from the reading this week, and I want you to keep this in mind in the context of the reading, he feels that monopolies are bad because people who monopolize markets tend not to innovate as much. So, you know, think of the Windows operating system. Is it really that much different in the past 10 years? No, not really. It's not wildly different. So maybe there's something to that people that are comfortable dominating a market tend not to innovate. And that's something I want you to think about. Others will say, hey, if you're in business, you need to obsolete yourself by innovating, and that way you keep competitors from coming in because you dominate everything. So, you know, maybe think of Apple and the iPhone. They keep improving it all the time, and that keeps competition out. So that's something to think about as we get to the discussion post. This notion of the Gilded Age and Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan, these people are known by some as the robber barons because they control markets, they exploit labor, they get very rich, and this is all happening in the late 1800s, and there's no government regulation against monopolies. So the first law comes into place, the Sherman Act, I think in 1890, the date's not important for y'all, but it marks the first government regulation of business. So make sure that you know this theme, that this module, this unit, is about the rise of big business and the fact that government starts to regulate business to help keep the economy sound, to help protect markets, to help intrastate commerce, because prior to that time, only states really had the power to regulate business. So that's the whole point of this chapter, that business rises up, it gets really big. This notion of a mega corporation or mega company starts to come into play in the late 1800s. Government sees this, reacts very slowly, and starts to enact laws like the Sherman Act to control the size of business. So that's the main point of the chapter. I kind of end the Gilded Age around 1901, and there's a reason for that. If you know anything about the history, President McKinley is shot in 1901 in Buffalo. Teddy Roosevelt's the vice president. He takes over, and he comes into office in 1901 and vows to be a trust buster. This notion of trusts is where someone like Rockefeller buys all the petroleum countries in the all the petroleum companies in the country, and then forms a trust where they are all run by the same group of people. And Roosevelt comes in 1901 and says that we can't have this, it's bad for the economy. These companies have a larger revenue stream than the whole country does at the time. So, you know, people like Rockefeller are making billions of dollars, and the revenue of the United States is like $500 million at that time. So the government gets involved, they're slow to respond, and the narrative you can take away from me is there's been sort of a cat and mouse game ever since. Businesses try to do things differently to get around the rules, and the government comes in and makes new rules. So that's kind of the way it goes all the way up to today. So those are the big points of the chapter. Let me just flip my notes here so I make sure I cover everything. There's a really important point on page 256 and 257. That's the stuff I just talked about, this notion of government regulation for the first time in monopolies. So make sure you pay attention to that, and you'll be good to go. In order to be successful on these micro quizzes, make sure you know the module objectives. I post them right there in the module, and those are the things that I use to create the quiz, so it's really easy. If you have any questions, let me know. Everyone's doing a great job. Have a great day. Talk to you soon. Thanks.